I was born and reared on Newton Ards Road, lower end of Newton Ards Road, and I was born in 1919, and I was brought up for what people would call the Depression years, when there was no work anywhere virtually in Belfast. It was between the years of the 1920s and 1930s, and something I want to impress on you here and on other people. The people had nothing, but they had pride and they had self-respect.
And what about your mum and dad? Did your dad work? Was he able to work? Or?
My dad was out of work for 7 years. He was a shipwright by trade, and he was a very ardent trade unionist. And when they got him out, they kept him out a little longer than he might otherwise have been. And he wouldn't be bought. He stuck to his guns about his union activities.
Man of principle.
I mean, yep.
So times were tough.
Yeah. We didn't have very much, but what we had was kept clean and tidy, and you were taught manners and you were taught respect for people.
When did you and Anne meet?
About 1939, I would guess. Now it's roughly about. It'd be roughly about right. I was 21, so I was born 1919 to 21, talking about 1939, 1940.
Yeah. And where did you meet?
We met at the Willowfield Dance Hall on the Woodstock Road. And the funny thing about it was, she caught my eye, and I didn't know it. I had caught her eye. I was only a little touch, obviously, and I didn't think it would have been interested in somebody like me, but apparently I was wrong.
Tell us a bit about your football career.
I kicked football as a kid, and in those days of the Depression years, many of the men, most of the men had no jobs, and part of the things they did pastime was like a bit of a kick about in the street with a ball, or the old game of marbles and things like that, or sing song at the corner of the streets at night, things like that. But I played even among the men and things like that, and then played in the school team and whatever, and went up through the various leagues, minor and churches league, amateur league. But then turn showed an interest in me, and then I signed for Cliftonville. But I always would have liked to have been a bit taller and whatever. But
what position did you play?
Anywhere.
Anywhere they'd have you?
But funny, I preferred to play left back.
Really?
Yeah. I'll tell you a wee story about that. I had a practice match up at Cliftonville, and they asked me if I could play outside left. They wanted to play a big fella called McBride. I said, oh, okay. So who was I playing against? Alfie McMichael. Alfie became the Northern Ireland left back for years. Went to Newcastle and then went to play for Northern Ireland. But I discovered in the first 5 minutes he only had one foot, and all he had to do was push it by his weak foot and run. And I joked to Alfie many years afterwards. I met him, but I'd give you a queer roast and one, and Alfie, you're older than me. And a bit of a nice laugh. I was faster too, a bit of a laugh, but a nice bloke, by the way. Real nice fella. But then we had just moved into that new house, and Saturday nights were Tuesday and Thursday. And it was more important for me to earn the money because I could play football any time. But so I played amateur league football till I was about 37.
Right. I would have said you were a tough wee man on the football pitch.
Well, I got that name.
So what about him as a toddler then? I mean, there's the story of him always kicking the tennis ball everywhere.
Yeah.
And I mean, when can you recall what age he was when you first saw him kicking the ball?
Well, he worked at 10 months, which was probably remarkable of itself. But instinctively, he seemed to know that, well, he was fascinated by a ball, but instinctively, he seemed to know that it was meant to kick, whatever size, whatever colour, and even if it had been a rugby ball, he would still have kicked it. Yeah. And I took photographs of him using an old Kodak box camera. around about 15, 16 months of age, he would have been. And he just seemed so natural in the photographs. He had the balance, concentration, head down over the ball. And then, of course, as a few years went by, I started to encourage him to kick with either foot. And because I could always do it myself, I was able to show him by example that he could do it. He looked at me and I said, kick with the other foot. And he can't, but then I was able to show him, right, left, right, things like that. And I just said to him, well, if you want to be a footballer, that's what you have to do. But I never in my wildest dreams saw him turn out to be the star he was, because there's so many uncertainties in life that you can't guarantee anything. And a kid could show talent and yet not pursue that talent, maybe take up a different career completely. So I just left it to him, and he joined the boys' club, and he went through the various age groups playing for them. Even as a toddler from 10-year-old onwards, he even took a tennis ball to bed with him. He was just, and people used to say to me, that wee boy of yours is going to be a footballer. And then he practiced with either foot against the gable wall of the shops where we live, and he practiced top half of the wall with his right foot, bottom half with his left, and then he reversed it. And then, of course, I showed him how to trap the ball sideways or under his foot, But he didn't take much teaching, really, because he had that basic skill, and the most important thing of all was his balance. He could have balanced on a knife edge. Even as a youngster, once I had got him to kick with both feet, we had that green area at the end of my street, and you would have seen him, even on wet days, up and down that field, right foot, left foot, juggling, jinking, and all. And he did that all on his own, just practice, practice, practice. So no matter how good he was, he seemed to want to get better. And as I always say, he was born with a good name.
Tell us about when he did his 11 plus.
Well, he did 11 plus, and he went to the Grosvenor High School when it was on the Grosvenor Road. A lot of people don't know this. The present Grosvenor School it is. When George wrote in one of the books about when he used to be coming home from school, he had to pass the Catholic area, and kids used to throw stones at him because of their blazer. They knew they were Protestants, whatever. And they played rugby, and he didn't want to play rugby, but they were forced, as it were, to attend for practice at rugby on a Saturday morning, or come and watch the team play on a Saturday morning. And he didn't like that, because it meant he couldn't play for the Craigie Boys Club.
But to kind of stop you, I mean, rugby must have been tough for George, if he was such a skinny wee boy.
Well, but actually they had played him apparently at wing 3/4 and a couple of things, and they were quite happy with him, because he was game and he was fast and whatever. But he preferred the round ball. And so he started missing days in school. So when that was discovered, they took the scholarship off him.
How was it discovered?
Well, it was actually my sister-in-law who found his school bag buried behind her bin, and she told us. But of course
So what was he doing, Dickie? What was George doing?
He was missing school, hiding his.
He was going round to her house,
hiding the bag, and then going away for long walks on his own, down through the parks and things like that, just killing time. And then of course he arrived back home with his school bag, but the school, I don't know whether somebody informed the school or whether they just took the measure on their own, or the education authority, but they took a scholarship from him. And meanwhile, we went ahead and got him fixed up in this Nashara Secondary School.
Now, clearly he was a bright boy.
Yeah, he was. No, he was very bright, and I mean, he carried that with him because George could talk to you about any subject, and he was a great reader and everything else. But once he went to listen to Shara, he never looked back because he was either always first or second in the classes.
But at Grosvenor, his results had gone down because he wasn't happy.
Yeah. He wasn't really. He wasn't happy, but once he went to listen to Charlotte, although they didn't play in a competitive league, they still played football. They arranged friendly games and like that. But he was never happy, sort of stay unless he had a ball at his toe.
So when did how did Manchester United first become interested in George?
Well, Bob Bishop, he became the local scout. He replaced Bob Harper, who had just died, and Bob worked hand in glove with Harper with a club called Boyland, and they were sending Eric McNarry across, and Bob was looking for some other kids to go, and he inquired from Bud McFarlane, is any likely lads at Craigie there? And Bud said about George, and he always enthused about George. He had never any doubt in his mind that George was going to be something different. And he brought him up, arranged a couple of trial matches, one of them against players 2 years older, and he was very impressed. Sent him across.
Did Bob come and talk to you?
He came and asked if it was okay for him to go and whatever. And I said yes, if he wants to go, because I didn't put pressure on George. If he had said no, I don't want to go, that would have been it over, and I wouldn't have been disappointed.
What did Anne feel about this?
Well, to be obviously as a mother, and I suppose as a father too, we knew that we would miss him. And in fact, I'll tell you the truth, on the first night that he went away, we both lay in bed and cried. And that is true.
What happened on that first trip over to Manchester? What happened to him and Eric?
Well, I didn't know this till years afterwards, but I know the scout didn't go with him. Eric's brother and I left them down to the boat. But they went aboard the boat, and we took for granted that there was a meeting on the other side. There was nobody to meet them. Made their own way to the station, nobody at the station. Now, in the event that somebody missed them at the boat, their first thing they said to them was went to the station, tried to get them there. I mean, they were bound to stick out, 2 young kids together carrying their baggage, but there was nobody there. But they came off at Manchester and nobody there, and they went on. Got a taxi to the ground because we had both given them money, John to his brother, and I had given money to George. So they got there. Now, I've never found out since how they got back when they decided to come home, whether the club drove them to Liverpool or not. So I don't know what happened there.
But how long did they stay there?
About a day and a half. I was on my summer holidays, and my wife, she was doing a wee part-time job now at Creameries across the road, virtually. And I was still in bed having a cup of tea. She was getting ready to go to work. And I heard the rap at the door, and then I heard a voice. I thought, that's George. So I hopped into my trousers, down the stairs. It was him. And I looked at him. I said, what are you doing here? He says, it's homesick. I said, well, don't worry about it. He says, you've done nothing wrong, nothing to be ashamed of. It happened to any, even grown-ups. So, wife went on to work. So he gave me a slip of paper of his pocket, Joe Armstrong, address in Stockport, phone number. Please ring. There's the charges. So we hadn't a phone at the time.
And who Joe Armstrong was?
He was the chief scout at Old Trafford. Within the club, he was the chief scout. Wee man, not much bigger than me, by the way. But he said, I said, what's the purpose of the call? He said, well, we're disappointed the boys didn't give it a better chance. Never happened before. So of course I couldn't dispute that one way or other. So he said, by the way, he said, what we've seen your boy was, we'd like him to come back for another try. I said, well, if he does, he comes of his own accord. I won't be putting pressure on him. And I didn't know at the time, and I was disappointed. I thought, it can't be right. Only asked St George, was not asked Eric. But I spoke to Eric about a few months back. He lives in Leeds. And I rang him and spoke to him. And I asked him, he said no, he said I was asked to go back as well. He said, but I couldn't face up to leaving my family again. Although he later went back, went to Middlesbrough and played for Northern Ireland as well. But so then I come back, bought my paper and come back. I remember having a cup of tea across a wee folding table, and I was flicking through the paper, pretending I was reading, but not really, and waiting for the inevitable question. It came up, what did Mr. Armstrong want? I said, well, they're disappointed. I said, they don't want you back. And I seen a change in his expression, and I thought, he doesn't like that. His pride's hurt or something. I couldn't really explain what it was, but I knew something wrong. So I folded the paper, I opened the paper again, and then I folded it, and I said to him over the top of the folded paper, they do want you back. When? I said, no, you have to wait and think. But no, I want to go back. What do I do? I said, well, we have to write to them. So he waited for about half an hour, and he asked me if I would write a letter for him. So I wrote the letter. He asked to see it, handed it to him. He read it, handed it back. So I put it in an envelope, sealed it, addressed it, gave it back. He says, no, it's yours. You post it when you want to go.
It took courage for him to go back.
Yeah, but I don't think he regarded it as courage. I think he just regarded it as he had a chance to go back. He possibly thought, well, I missed an opportunity, and he went back. And I do know that for at least a year he fought homesickness. I do know that. But he stuck it out, so he did. And then, of course, he got to the stage where you couldn't get him to come home.
Did he train hard?
Well, from what the reports that I heard from other players and all, he was one of the hardest trainers at the ground, and one of the fastest as well. One of the things about him with regard to his football was, no matter how good he was, he wanted to get better. I'll give you an example of that, which he only told me about a few years ago. When the rest of the players left after training, he stayed behind, and he practiced taking corner kicks from the right wing with his left foot. Then he went to the left wing and he practiced taking corner kicks with his right foot, and his target was the centre of the crossbar. Now that's dedication.
When did George make his professional debut?
He was about 4 months over 17. They played him against West Bromwich, against a fellow called Graham Williams, the Welsh international. And he gave George a rough passage, even though he was only a youngster. But in the switch, George, the other wing, and put Bobby Charlton to the outside right. But then he went back into the lower division teams at the ground. Then he was home at Christmas of that year, and we got a telegram for him to collect the ticket at the airport, come straight back. They'd been beaten 5 or 6 by Burnley. You know, over the Christmas holiday, the way they worked, they try to have 2 teams locally. It's, example, Liverpool, Everton. You know, Liverpool coming to Manchester, Manchester team going to Liverpool. And that's the way they worked it. And
why was that?
It was for travelling convenience over the holidays, and so they were to play. Had played Burnley, and they were beat 5 or 6, something like that. And they brought back. When they got George back, they played him in that match, and he scored either 1 or 2 goals in the game, and him and Willie Anderson were turned out as 2 youngsters, and they returned to Compliment. They beat Burnley 5 or 6. And he never looked back after that. He was a never present in the team from then on.
What about the other famous names in the team? I mean, as you're talking about George never looked back, and everybody talks about Best, Charlton and Law.
Yeah.
As the team developed and progressed, they became the three absolute stars of the team. Did you have much contact with other players in the team, like Bobby Charlton?
Oh yes, I met them all, because if and when George got me my tickets, sometimes he said to me, "Dad, I'm going to have a cup of tea with the lads. I've got to go and give somebody some tickets." And I met up with all the players on a regular basis. And then after the game, even in the lounge after the game, you know, for a cup of tea or if you wanted a beer or whatever, it was there. And I got to know them all pretty well. And they were all fine. Bobby was a bit, wee bit odd in his way. He was never rude to me, but he was just. But I mean, since I've met Bobby several times since it, and he's fine. You know, but it may just have been his nature. He's just. I don't know. You can't tell about people for sure what they're thinking and say maybe he might have been a bit jealous of George taking his thunder. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe it's just his nature. But he was never ever rude to me. But the rest of the players were terrific. Nobby Stiles, Pat Kerr, and all them. They were all fine.
Well, let's talk a wee bit about George the footballer and his skills and his talent. Talk to me about some of the memories you have of the goals he scored and how you realised, you know, just what a great player he was.
Well, there's a few examples of things he did that were even unusual by his standards or by anybody's standards. In one game against Chelsea, Chopper Harris had brought him down, and as George was down, he pushed himself back off the ground, but didn't go. He raided himself all in the one movement, and the ball still in control at his feet. He rounded Harris, lifted his head, and he looked. Now he must have been at an angle. He must have been about 35 yards out. And Peter McNarry, the cat as they called him, he was a hell of a good keeper, and he was about 2 yards of his line. George had a quick look, curled it right into the net. Another goal that he scored was against Tommy Lawrence, an unusual one too. Now Tommy Lawrence was a big man, and when you take Tommy jumping to catch a ball, say he's 2 foot of the ground, the length of his body plus his arms, you're talking about 10, 11 feet in the air, and he was just about to clutch the ball, and George went up with him, nodded out of his hands. Didn't just nod out of his hands, he nodded down and into the net. Tommy fell on his backside, and he just sat and looked at George. Says, "How the hell did you do that?" And of course, the famous Gordon Banks one. I mean, that was a goal.
Tell us just the story of that. Tell us who they were playing, where it was at, all of that.
Well, they were playing against England, and
it was at Windsor Park.
Windsor Park, and Banks got the ball. He was about to field it, and George went up close to him. Banks threw the ball up, or pretended to throw it up that way, but went the other way, and George read it, and he just hooked it out of the air. It bounced. George had it around, headed him in the net. Banks claimed he had been fouled, but I mean, in the Express on Monday, it showed you shots of it, and the heading across the top was who fouled who, because Banks tried to grab him around the waist to pull him back. But I mean, I spoke to George that evening after the match about it, and he said, "Dad, I knew what he was going to do before he did it." And he did the same with Harry Gregg the next week. not exactly the same, but Paddy gathered the ball. George walked right up against him for it, and eye to eye sort of thing. And then he turned to walk away, and Pat went to field the ball, and George lifted his hip up or his thigh up and hit him there, rolled it down his leg, turned around and put it in the net. And it was, and of course that goal he scored against Benfica, the one where he went up between the two defenders and headed it down. And of course the one in the '68 final, that's the one he said he felt like laying down and heading into the net.
This is after he'd rounded the keeper?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, there was some remarkable goals. And of course the 6 against Northampton, I mean, okay, it wasn't the top opposition, but they were still all professionals. And the goalkeeper in that game, he said, "Christ, here he's coming again." No, and of course the one we spoke about yesterday about that goal in America, that was an incredible goal, that, because he beat so many players in such a short space. And
tell us who he was playing for and who they were playing against.
He's playing for the Aztecs against the New York Cosmos. And I mean, that New York Cosmos side had about 7 internationals in their team. The Beckenbauer and Pele and Cubillas and all famous players, all in their own rights.
When did he make his debut for Northern Ireland? What was it? Can you remember what his first?
It was against Wales, either Swansea or Cardiff. And the funny about it was that I had bought the paper the next morning. It was the old Wig, as they called it then, and they virtually said they didn't see why they were raving about this youngster, this young lad Best. But then our next match was against Uruguay at Windsor Park, and George turned out he played a blinder, and that was him sort of established then.
There are 2 other games I want to talk to you about. The first one was what some people say was his greatest match ever, but he never scored in it. It was the Scotland game at Windsor Park.
He didn't score because Ronnie Simpson played out of his skin, Scottish goalkeeper. George would have scored 6, 7 or 8 in that match, only for Simpson. Simpson was terrific. What do you call it? Tommy Gamble was on in that match, and he asked the right back that he wanted to change places, and the right back said, "I'm bloody sure I don't."
He'd lost it. I remember him playing without his boot at one stage in that.
Yeah, he took a corner kick. His boot come off. He left it and went on.
The other match was the second leg against Benfica in Portugal. When I think this is just for the benefit of the tape. But hadn't Matt Busby said now, played very cagey? so just tell that story from the beginning.
Matt told him to go out and sort of defend.
Can you say what match it was exactly? Was it a second leg of the quarter-final or semi-final?
It was the second leg of the semi-final. What do you call it? No, Matt had told him to go out and sort of play it a bit defensively for the first 20 minutes, get yourself settled down. But one of the papers reported that George must have heard him because he scored 2 in the first 7 minutes. And funny thing about it, I was on nights at the time, and I had taken my radio in, and I ran to our inspection, listened to him, and switched it on, and I couldn't believe my ears when I heard United are 9-2 up. This boy Best has turned on a wonderful display. He scored 2 terrific goals. But then when I seen the 2 goals up, when we went up between the 2 defenders and headed it down, he's done that twice against Benfica, actually. No, but the other match I do remember was when they played in Madrid against Real Madrid, and one of the European Cup matches, obviously. And a draw was no good to them, and George got the ball in the down seconds, and he went along the wing, and I got this impression, this is it. But he held the ball, held it, and he pulled it back, and who was there for a stroke it into the net? Bill Folks. The last man you would expect to be there because he had no great speed or anything else, but he was there for a stroke it into the net, and they came out on aggregate. They won the match and they went on to the final. But I mean, it was just when George got the ball, it was as if like, this is it. We have to do this now.
I want to go back and talk about the end of his Manchester United career.
Yeah.
How it appeared to you. That's what I mean. I'm trying to get your views on how it all sort of, not went wrong. I don't mean it like that, but you know what I mean. How did it feel from where you were in Belfast? I mean, their concerns and everything. Well,
from what I can gather from what George told me, something that I saw myself. They won the '68 Cup final, but after they won it, the team started to go on the decline because the players were all getting older, with the exception of a couple of them. Nobby was getting on a bit, Paddy was getting on a bit, Folks was getting on a bit, Tony Dunn, and them were all getting on it. And George, then they went into the second division. Well, into the second division, as they called it then. And George didn't think that is where they should have been. And then make England come on the market, and Busby and he bid for him, and Tottenham bid for him, and Matt went higher, and they went higher. And then it went to something like 92,000 or something, and Matt said he wouldn't go into an auction, and he dropped out. And Tottenham went to 98,000 and they bought him. And George thought that United should have bought him. That was his, and then built a team round like that. It didn't happen. And the funny thing about it, I met Mike England. I met him a few times actually, but I met him at the PFA Awards there. Well, it was over with me and all a while ago. And met him at the PFA Awards. And he said to me, give me a bit of a hug. He said, he says, Mr. Best, the greatest compliment I was ever paid in my life was your boy wanting me to play in United with him. So, and that's another thing too that makes me very proud about George. It was the respect he got from other players, because Jim Baxter told me in his pub in Glasgow that George was the greatest player he'd ever seen or ever played against. Tommy Smith told me the same thing in Los Angeles, and he said, we used to be sent out to scare George, and we only wasted our so-and-so time. And Peter Osgood told me in the Europa Hotel, if anybody ever said a word against your boy, he said I would give him these, and he put the two big ham fists up. And Emlyn Hughes on the This Is Your Life programme, George was brought in that night as one of the guests, and when George went to sit down, he put his arm on his shoulder, and he said, can I say something before George sits down? So, yeah. He said, this is the greatest player I've ever seen or ever played against. So, I mean, when you get that, and even the people who kicked him, well, they respected him. They respected him so much that they went to any dance for to kick him. That seems an analogy in terms of, but that's the way it looked to me,
So really, in a way, George, because Matt really failed to start rebuilding the team, George became a bit disillusioned.
He did, yeah. He didn't think that they should have a team like Manchester United should be in the second division. Of course, you knew the story about who put them there. Dennis Law, that Pack Heel. He says he never scored a goal with such regret in all his life. He said he felt like crying.
He walked off
He did. He did.
He just said substitute me, didn't he?
But you see, Dennis is a great bloke. Valet's met him, Barbara's met him, we've all met him. He's a character. And he idolised George as well, as a friend, not just as a player, but as a friend.
Let's talk about George leaving Manchester United, because obviously, you know, it's just, he'd been with the club since he was 15, so it was a big decision, wasn't it?
After they won the European Cup in '68, the team, they were all getting on a bit in years, and they started deteriorating a bit. And George wasn't happy with the situation, and then when they went into the second division, as it was known at that time, he was very unhappy about that. And he thought that the club weren't doing enough to get them back on their feet. And he wanted them to sign, well, Make England was on the market, and Tottenham were bidding for him, United were bidding for him, and Matt Busby went to 92,000, and Tottenham went to 98, I think it was. And then Busby said he wouldn't go into an auction, and he bought Ian Ure instead. Now, Ian wasn't a bad player, but he wasn't a Make England. And George thought that was probably, they'd done a wrong thing. They should have started building around it, like of him and Make England and a couple of other players who still had a bit left in them. But then, of course, he did the runner. He used to play against Chelsea, and only Chelsea came into George's life quite a lot. But he used to play against Chelsea, and he did a runner, and he rang me to tell me he was coming home, and I asked if I would meet him at the airport. He had bought a car, and he'd given it to me, and I went up to the airport and spoke to the airport police and asked if I could park the car outside the building, which at that time you weren't allowed to do, and I gave them the keys, showed them my identification, and I went in and met him, and the reporters were coming out of the woodwork sort of thing. They had got the word that he was on his way, and they asked me, of course, what are you doing here, Mr. Best? And I said, see, you know what I'm doing here. And George came out and he spoke to them. Well, they spoke to him, got around him, and then I asked him not to follow us, leave us, wanted to get home and get shot. But of course, they did follow us, but nobody got into the house. I just kept them all out. But then he eventually went back, as I remember. But then he just decided that he wasn't going back at all, and he went to America. But then he came back from America, and Tommy Doherty had taken over at that time, and he got George Coates to sign again, which he did, and he told him he didn't care what he did in his private life, as long as he turned up for training and whatever. And George didn't turn in on a Thursday. They were to play Plymouth in one of the rounds of the Cup. Plymouth were a third division side or something at the time. And when George arrived on Saturday, he wasn't on the team sheet, and he asked why, and Doherty said, you didn't train on Thursday? He said, I did, but I didn't come in the morning, I come in the afternoon. He said, well, you're not playing anyhow. And then George said, well, if I'm not fit to play against Plymouth, he said, I won't be back. And he walked out and he never went back.
How would you like him to be remembered?
Well, I mean, obviously, as footballers go, I think no matter where the subject crops up, George will be remembered as one of the greats. And that's not me just saying that. That has been shown, proved in many ways. But I'd like him to be remembered as a down-to-earth bloke who didn't make a big deal of who he was and what he was. And another thing that I'm proud of about George is that he had nothing against people because of their class, colour or creed. He had no interest in politics or people's religions or beliefs. And that is one of the things that I'm very proud of him for as well.
And you miss him?
Oh yes, yes. I'd like to see him walking through that door. We didn't see as much of him as a family as we would have liked to. In the last few years, whatever, Barbara probably seen more of him than what we did, because it was her having a house in France. He went across there and for a bit of a break and all. But it would be nice to have seen him more often, but that's the way it goes. You know the story about how when he went away at the start and he came back again, and then he went back again. But he was homesick for about a year, but then it got to the degree that you couldn't get him to come home. But then again, he was tied up in his work and his job as a footballer. He had his training to do. He had to play international matches. He had to play overseas matches for United, you know. So I suppose he had limited opportunities of getting home, really.
But what a life he had, Dickie.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I suppose many people, outside of his problem with the drink, I suppose many people would have given their lives for they lived the way he did, you know, and whatever. But I'll always be proud of him, because I understand his drink problem better than maybe most people would do, but because I used to go to open meetings in Shaftesbury Square Hospital, which deals with all addictions, and Dr. Muirhead, the chief authority there, he would have told you that you don't know when you take your first ever drink where it's going to lead. And the second thing impressed on you was that alcohol is a drug. And there's nobody sets out to be an alcoholic.
That last week must have been very tough on you, Dickie.
Yeah, but well, the one consolation was that George heavily sedated, of course, but he sort of slept away in a way peacefully, and we all spoke in his ear before they just decided that it was over for him, and it was hard to credit how much the two doctors took it to heart, because it formed a friendship of a sort, some bond with George, you know. When we were at his bedside that last day and night, I was actually trying to transmit my thoughts to him, George, let go. You know, because he wasn't in agony according to what they said. He wasn't having any pain or anything. But you know, we all spoke in his ear and whatever, including Dr. Elisa. He did the same thing as we did. So it was very, very genuine, the whole thing. Mm.
I always remember the pictures of you after he died, and you had to go out and face the press. And you stood there very dignified and very quiet, and all you just said was at the end, "Please leave us alone." What exactly prompted you? Why did you decide to do that?
Well, Barbara already had spoken. She already had told him, well, George is gone, sort of thing, and whatever. And then I just asked him, would they just go away and leave us to grieve in peace? I said that's just a human request, and some of them went and some of them didn't. Now, I don't know whether they were all press or there could have been television companies to go about, but at the end of the day, they were all. One of them even ventured to try to speak to me, and Barbara, she just cut him short. Just.
Can I move you forward then to the week leading up to the funeral? How did you stay sane through that? Because it really was a very pressured week, wasn't it?
I don't really know. I suppose it's like everything else in life. You've got to face up to it and accept it. And I suppose the one consolation was that George didn't die alone, and he didn't die an agonising death. At least as far as we've been told by the hospital, he was in no pain. But I suppose we just had to accept it it was over. And
I mean, everybody was very, very impressed by the dignity you showed on the day itself.
well, I mean, I didn't see it as anything, only just a natural reaction, you know, because we have never ever as a family in any way went over the top about George. I mean, we never boasted about him. We didn't think that we were special. Because to me, George he was born with a gift. And even when he became a name, that was one of the things I said to him. Now remember, you're just lucky you were born with a gift. Keep your feet in the ground. And I think he did.
Oh, yes, he did. When you were driving to Stormont, or you were being driven to Stormont, and then, you know, and you saw and then up to Roselawn, and there were all those crowds. How did you feel about that?
It was amazing to see it. It was, and it gave me a feeling. I was sad, but I was proud. You know, the people, and I don't know if you heard the story about it or not. The big Jim told last night,
What?
or his wife told rather, Linda. As we went down the aisle, I touched Jim just on the arm. And the man beside Jim said, "Oh, Jesus. And who was it? Inspector Flanagan. He was in tears."
So many people were in tears that day. Dickie.
I mean, there was a hardened policeman who had seen probably most of everything over the troubles, dead bodies, dead people, bits and pieces of bodies, and he was in tears. No, as I say, I had a great feeling of pride in the reaction of the people to George's death. I mean, that was a wet, miserable November day, and the people turned out in their thousands. Yeah, it was amazing. But even yet, I mean, we get people from all over the world contacting us by letter, or even coming. We've had people from Italy, people from Australia, people from different parts of America, and whatever. And we've had letters from Germany and things like that. You know, it's...
He was public property, wasn't he?
Yeah, in many ways, I suppose in many ways he was, but as long as it was good public reaction to him as a person, apart even from his football ability. I mean, people liked his personality even, and he was never boastful or big-headed about himself.
George was 6, I think, when I was born. George was the eldest, obviously, followed by my sister Carol. I think there's about 15 months between Carol and George, and then I came along.
And what are your earliest memories of him?
Actually, not that many. The happiest memories that I have would be of the three of us all clowning about in the house, and George was always a bit of a character, and he was always so funny, and he was always up to mischief, and Carol and him used to fight all the time, and he was just a bit of a character. He was always a bit of a character with a great sense of humour.
A good big brother?
Yes, from what I can remember. I mean, I was very, very young. You've got to remember that I was only 11 when George actually went off to Manchester, so childhood memories are very vague. There are certain things which stand out, things like the time my grandfather Withers died, you know, Christmases, that sort of thing, special occasions, but I don't remember any bad times with George.
Can you tell me a bit about when he went to Manchester? Did you have much sense of just how big all this was, what was happening?
I realised that something unusual was happening in the house. I mean, I obviously understood that George had been chosen to go off to have some trials for Manchester United. I understood that. But the thing which I remember vividly was the awful, awful sadness in the house. It was hard to describe. There was such an overwhelming sadness. I mean, there was my brother and obviously my mum and dad's firstborn child, only 15 years of age, going, for us, such a long way away. I mean, we didn't get holidays. The furthest we got was Malile or Bangor or down to McNarry's wee cottage in the countryside. But for, our brother at only 15 to be going on this huge adventure, and the sadness in the house that day was just, it was palpable. It was very difficult.
Did things seem to change a lot after that? Or was it just sort of a blip in what seems to have been a very happy childhood?
Change from
the whole family's point of view?
Yes, they changed quite drastically after that, because it was within a very short space of time, well, within 2 years basically, that George hit the headlines, and our lives changed dramatically. Really, our lives then became quite public.
And of course he quickly got this nickname, the Fifth Beatle or El Beatle, and I mean, given that the Beatles were so big at that stage, I mean, he did become a sort of megastar, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. And it happened overnight. It happened after that game when he came back from Benfica. And he came back with a sombrero, and he had the long hair of, the Beatles style in those days. And there's a story, I'm not sure if people are aware of it, that after the game, one of the supporters from the opposition rushed towards him with was either a knife or a pair of scissors, and obviously George was horrified, but this chap just wanted a piece of his hair. He just wanted to cut off a piece of his hair. So yes, I think after that, I mean, George's life and our lives took on a totally different direction. Certainly from a family point of view, it was a very surreal situation, because we still knew him as our brother who'd gone away 2 years previously, and now here he was, a superstar in the papers daily, basically, after that.
How did your friends react to all of this?
True friends just took it in their stride. I seldom spoke about George, really. I was really quite shy about speaking about him. However, there were many occasions where people, for whatever reason, best known to themselves, obviously didn't like the fact that I had a brother with this fame, and they would have been quite difficult about it sometimes.
In what way?
Well, for example, I remember going to one of our local discos, as it was in those days, one evening, and minding my own business, just, having a dance with some friends, and a couple of people bumping into me and saying, "Oh, you're George Best's sister, you think you're something, but you're nothing but an orange bee." Totally out of the blue, and I thought, well, where did that come from? And then I didn't rise, because, I was very shy and very nervous as well, and that was fine. The dance ended, the disco ended, and we went outside, and I heard someone shouting, "There she is there." And the next thing, I felt this horrendous pain in the inside of my right leg. And basically, to cut a long story short, I'd been shot in the leg by an air rifle. And I remember getting home and just sitting at the top of the stairs at home and calling my mum and dad out. And I had this 6-inch in diameter bruise on my leg. And that's what the police reckoned. The police reckoned that it was with an air rifle. And that was totally unprovoked, because I didn't go about spouting about George. I was very proud of him, but I was very shy, and I just didn't really speak about him very much.
What about press? Did they chase you specifically? Were they trying to intrude on your lives as much as on George's?
Yes, George was top news. Everybody wanted to find out a bit more about George Best, and especially after a specific game. I say in those days, whenever in my teenage years, George was in the press for all the right reasons, and everybody just wanted a little bit of George Best, and they used to be constantly at the house, whether he'd had a good game or whether he'd had a new girlfriend. It didn't matter what George Best did. The press wanted to know about it, and they would have gone to any lengths basically to find out about it, including coming to our home and, questioning us as children. And, we were a bit naive in those days, and you didn't really think, and sometimes you told them stuff, and mind you, we learned very quickly not to.
Is there any sort of story or incident that stands out that illustrates that for you? An example of them making something up or getting it wrong, or?
The one thing which sticks with me very much. Now, this was not about a nasty incident in saying that. It was about a nice incident. George was in the headlines. I can't remember what the incident was, but George was yet again headline news, and our family home was bombarded by press. We used to have to sit with the Venetian blinds closed, just to try and get a bit of privacy. And I remember at that stage, a young reporter coming to the door, and my mum, and it's well documented that my mum was an alcoholic, and she'd had a few wee drinks that night, and I was trying to keep her away from the press, but nothing would do. She had to come to the door, and I'm trying to keep her behind the door, and she's trying to open the door, and this young lad's trying to get information out of me. And eventually my mum, spoke to him, and words ensued, and she was very upset, and he basically turned around and said to her, well, what would you know? You're nothing but a drunk, and if it wasn't for the likes of us, your son wouldn't be where he was today. Now, you can imagine at the age of 13 or 14 hearing that, and I would be very quick. And in those, I've mellowed now, but in those days I would have been very quick and very defensive. And I basically told him in no uncertain terms to clear away from the front door, don't come back again, leave us in peace. And what he had to remember, if it wasn't for the likes of George Best, he wouldn't be getting paid today.
When you see all those headlines and you're so far away from him, did you feel helpless at times?
Totally and utterly helpless. And because going back to the start of George's drinking, there was the gap that we didn't have the contact that we did in the last 20 years. And you could never get hold of him. When you did get hold of him, it was just, it's all right and everything's fine, don't worry about it. I think we worried about it more than he did, but it still made it very, very difficult to deal with.
Tell me about his relationship with his mum as you observed it. How did George feel about his mum? Well,
going back to our early years, as I said, we just were an ordinary family. Brothers and sisters, we fought together, we laughed together, we had just an ordinary upbringing. George seldom spoke about mum. But I have no doubt in my mind, and it became apparent during a documentary which was made 2 or 3 years back, I think, in France, when he became dreadfully upset. And that's the only occasion that I can actually remember George speaking about mum, but I have no doubt in my mind that he carried perhaps some guilt over the fact that he wasn't here as much as he could have been. But on reflection, and it's something that we've discussed recently, my sister and I have spoken about it, during the really bad times with my mum, when Carol would have phoned George begging him to come home, he would have said, yes darling, I'll be in the plane, I'll be home tomorrow, the day after. And he didn't come for whatever reason, we don't know, but on reflection, it probably was the start of his own alcohol problems, so probably my mum and George had the problem.
Did you feel cross with him at that time for not coming, or?
I didn't really at that stage, because by the time George's problem had become very bad, I was then married and I was off living in South Africa, so I was quite fortunate that I had been removed from an awful lot of that. But no, I find it very difficult to stay angry with George about anything. He just has that way of, he just disarms you instantly. He just, you can be furious with him and for whatever he's done, and he just comes and gives you that smile or that wink or, okay sis, and he just carries on as if nothing has ever happened.
So when did you start to sort of re-establish proper brother-sister contact again?
Probably about 21, 22 years ago, when Norman and I got together. Norman had no idea who I was, and it was just one evening we were watching television. There was a particular programme which I wanted to watch, and Norman said, yeah, sure, fine, and we switched it over and it was George, and I think my mum was in it too, and Norman said, well, why do you want to watch this? I said, it's my brother, and we'd been going out together for quite some time. Anyway, it was Norman who said, well, do you never see him? And I said, no, he wouldn't want to see me. It's been such a long time. We've lost contact. I've been in South Africa. He's been off, obviously, doing his own thing. He wouldn't be interested. But Norman persisted and thought I should make a bit of an effort, which I did. And we would go off to London for shows or rugby or whatever. And practically without exception, George was always there. If he said he was going to be there, he never let us down. A couple of occasions, but nothing major. You know, maybe very loose agreements, very loose arrangements. And that's really about 21 years ago. And over the years, I'm not saying at the start it was fantastic, but we started off and we built it up and we built it up and we built it up. And we just became that little bit closer. And as he got older, became that little bit closer as well.
His playing career, of course, was over by this time.
His playing career would have been over, yeah, by this stage.
So you and Norman had re-established contact with George, but this was at a time when his life was really becoming public for all the wrong reasons. And just like as a footballer, he'd been in the headlines all the time for his football. Now he was in the headlines because of his drinking and because of the women in his life and the scrapes he was getting into. How did you feel observing all that and now being, you know, close to him again or getting closer to him again?
I just sort of felt very, very helpless about it all because George was his own person and he did his own thing, and you could never have tried to dictate to him what to do. I mean, he was an alcoholic. He had huge problems overcoming it. He tried everything, in my opinion, humanly possible to overcome it. And yes, I used to get a little bit frustrated with him, a little bit angry with him, but by the same token, I used to get equally frustrated with the press because they latched on to every little story which they could, and they blew it out of all proportion. Everything was front page news when it came to George, and certainly in the later stages of his life, they forgot any pleasant things which he did do and always seemed to latch on to the nasty things. There were good times throughout all of that. Whenever, for example, Norman and I were very privileged to have gone to his, when he received his honorary doctorate at Queen's University. We were present, obviously, with the rest of the family when he became a Freedom of the Borough of Castlereagh. So there were lots of really, really pleasant times in between all that. And by and large, a lot of that time, he had stopped drinking. One of the many times where he had tried desperately hard to stop drinking. So there were lots of good times in there as well. But however, the bad times when they were bad, I think had a profound effect, not just on myself, but on the rest of the family, and in particular my father. He had to, you know, sit in the house and put up with all of this, and, you know, the press would ring, and my father's not really very tolerant of the press, so no comment, put the phone down. But nevertheless, it was very, very difficult to deal with it, and you know, the press have a way of manipulating stories and manipulating photographs and making, in my opinion, making things out to be what they're not really. I'm not saying there wouldn't have been an element in truth of some of the things, but the press always had a way of manipulating it to sensationalism.
When did your mum die?
My mum died in October 1978, at the age of 54.
And how do you think that affected George?
I think it had an impact on him. I think it saddened him. There again, he didn't speak about my mum's death very much until a couple of years ago when a documentary was made. And unfortunately, George was filmed with alcohol taken, and he did become very emotional. I have no doubt in my mind that mum's death affected him. He was gone a lot of the time that she was drinking, and wasn't really a lot of support, so I have no doubt that he did feel it.
Did he look to you for moral support or anything like that?
No, during the time when George was drinking, I don't think he looked to anyone for moral support. He was his own man. He was an alcoholic. He couldn't help what he did. He tried other means of support, you know, from a medical point of view, but certainly from an emotional point of view, he never certainly spoke to me about it, or he didn't look to me for any sort of support. I wish he had have, and I wish I could have given it, but however, it just wasn't his nature.
He'd hit the brick wall now. It was either have a transplant or he was going to die.
Yes, basically, he had no options left. He'd reached the end of the road. He was so ill that a liver transplant was the only way of saving his life. And
how do you think mentally he took that news?
On the surface, he seemed to take it very well. He accepted the enormity of what was ahead of him. He met all the criteria to receive this liver transplant. He stayed off alcohol. He seemed to be coping with it mentally very well. He seemed very buoyant, very positive. So yes, on the surface, everything seemed to be very, very positive.
And of course, there was no guarantee as to when it would happen or even if it would happen, because you need a donor.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And unfortunately, a lot of people, and I'm sure a lot of people to this day, still think that George jumped the queue for a liver, and that's just not the case. He had to wait. It's not just a case of getting a liver. There are certain things which have to be met, certain things which have to be matched, and George had to wait just like anyone else.
Of course, you've touched on an area where there was some begrudging publicity about it, about him jumping the queue, or because he was an alcoholic, did he deserve it? Have you had a chance to stand back and think, given the experience with your mum and with George, about what alcoholism is?
I think constantly about what alcoholism is. I worry constantly about my own position. I know certainly for 5 years I stopped drinking because I was just so afraid because of my mum and because of George. At the moment, I hope that I'm one of the lucky ones. I can take a drink or leave it, but I constantly think, what causes this problem, and why is it not just so simple? Why can't they stop drinking? But the only thing which I can compare it to is trying to stop smoking and looking what George went through the last couple of years. It must have been so difficult for him. So, I mean, if getting a liver was not enough to stop George, given the fact how ill he was during the actual operation and how he very nearly didn't make that, I don't have the answers to it. If it was that easy, then we wouldn't have alcoholics.
What did it mean to you when George and Alex said they were coming to live in Northern Ireland?
Oh, it obviously meant a lot. We were delighted. Now, I had my reservations about George and Alex living in Northern Ireland, especially where they chose to live. They had a beautiful house with a beautiful view, but however, it wasn't quite... It was just too far removed from the hustle and bustle which they were used to. I think on reflection it was possibly another way of George coping. He needed a project, he needed an interest. It's, I think, the typical dry drunk syndrome where they need a project to keep them occupied. And, if it's not one obsession, it's another. And in my opinion, I really believe George did want to come home for a while, but I think an awful part of it was anything new to try and keep him off alcohol. I was delighted to have him home. Norman and I had some brilliant times with Alex and himself. We had some rare evenings together, sober and maybe not so sober. But however, I didn't think it really was going to last, and it didn't. They went back to England.
And did they discuss with you going back to England, or did it happen quite suddenly?
It just happened. Well, I had seen the writing on the wall. He was still having to fly back quite often. He still had to work. He still had to earn a salary, and I could see that it was becoming a little bit difficult for them. But however, they didn't really discuss it. We had been out for a meal one night, and literally in the middle of a mouthful of food, he said, "Oh, we're going back to London," and that was it.
How early on did you realise that this was really serious?
People may disagree with this, but this is the honest opinion of both Norman and myself. When George first went into intensive care, to the best of my knowledge, it was the 4th of October. Norman and I were in France. We got a call from Phil to say that George was in intensive care. We flew straight back from France, and it was that day, it was that evening. We visited him. We left him at about 10:30 at night, and I'm afraid the alarm bells were ringing even then. That was on the 4th of October.
How did he look?
Horrendous. Even after his transplant, he obviously looked weak and ill, but this was something totally different. He could barely speak. He was very weak. He wasn't in bed, he was actually out of bed, but there was just something there, and I'll never forget, we left him and he tried to shout across the screen, "Bye, darling," but he was just so weak. And whenever we left, we both had the most awful feeling. We tried to remain optimistic, but he looked so ill that we were both very, very concerned.
And it was really for the next 6 weeks that he lingered and sometimes seemed to rally and then weaken again.
It was 8 weeks in total in intensive care, and obviously statistics prove that the longer you're in intensive care, the less chance that you have coming out of it. And I knew deep down in my heart that it wasn't looking good. Even on days when I spoke to Phil and he said, yeah, he's a little bit better, he had a spoonful of porridge or some little minor detail, I struggled daily to be optimistic. I just couldn't see anything happening at all. And some of the measures which they used for George, some of the treatment was very, very radical. But, I just sadly...
What about the care he received?
Second to none. Second to none. I have never... You often hear about medical staff being described as angels, but they were so professional, not only to the patient, but to the family. It was... And especially in the last 48 hours, I couldn't describe. They looked after us as much as they looked after my brother. They were just unbelievable, every single one of them. Even down to the canteen staff, bringing us cups of tea, and they were just amazing. Every single person was very supportive.
Were you with him when he died?
Yes.
One of the images I have then is of the family coming out and speaking to the press. That must have been incredibly difficult at that point.
It was difficult. However, I think because of the fact he had been in intensive care for so long, I was prepared for his death. I was very strong throughout that entire period, probably stronger than anyone, possibly with the exception of my father, who's an amazing man anyway. I'm not saying that I found it easy, but I found a strength, and it got me through it.
Tell us about your dad during those last hours.
Oh, he was just... My father, during George's last hours, just remained his dignified self. He sat on George's right-hand side. I sat on George's left-hand side with Callum. And he just sat there. Every now and again I would look at him. I didn't look at Dad because, it would have set me off. He was watching his son really in the last hours of his life, and, he spoke to him the odd occasion.
One of the images I have from when you went down to talk to the press was his last words to them. You remember when he asked them?
Yes, I think my dad asked, could you please leave us in peace now? Well, it was going to be difficult to leave us in peace. None of us could actually envisage what was ahead of us, but however, I have to say, in defence of the press, the morning before George died, on the Thursday morning when it became apparent for sure that he wasn't going to make it, I was at the hospital first. I was there very early, spoke to the medical staff. George isn't going to make it. And I thought, right, well, my father doesn't know this yet, and he's probably en route to hospital. I went out and I sort of stormed out through the doors like somebody not quite right in the head and said, could I please speak to someone in charge? I just got blank looks. And I then said, well, could I speak to someone from Sky? And a female reporter stepped forward, and I took her to the side, and I was obviously very distraught. And I said, well, George isn't going to make it, but my father doesn't know. He's on his way to the hospital now. Can I please ask you to leave him alone? And it's a scene which I'll never forget. It's a scene which I never imagined could happen with the press. I can't remember how many were there, 40, 50, 60. It was just a sea of cameras. And just at that, my father came around the corner with my other sisters, Julie, Grace, and one of their husbands, Pete. And I went over and I just shook my head, gave my dad a big hug, broke down. We had a bit of a quiet cry together, walked over towards the hospital doors, and not one camera was raised. Not one camera. In fact, cameras were put on the ground, cameras were lowered. And I remember just seeing some of the press just nodding at us, that knowing look, and I was just very grateful to them, not for me, but for my father, because I knew we actually didn't think we even had 24 hours. We thought we only had a few hours at that stage.
So George passed away, and that wasn't the end of anything. That was the beginning of one hell of a week. It
was the beginning of one hell of a week. it was just the most amazing week. He had a send-off way beyond our expectations, and I'm sure way beyond his own expectations. I firmly believe that he would never have envisaged that sort of a send-off, and it's something which I doubt the world will ever see again. For a sporting hero, it was just unbelievable. It was a long, hard week. Norman worked tirelessly with all the authorities. I did what I could, but no, anything which we wanted. Not that we made many demands. I mean, by and large, we think it was quite a simple ceremony. What we wanted, we got. All our requests were met. We insisted that it was local people who took part. We wanted the people brought in from the crowd. By and large, the funeral was for the people of Northern Ireland, and we tried as far as humanly possible to keep it that way.
And the people of Northern Ireland really responded.
Oh, did they what? The people of Northern Ireland have come into their own, as far as I'm concerned, with George. Okay, we had a lot of people who travelled across for George's funeral, don't get me wrong, but the people of Northern Ireland gave us support and a strength which we didn't think we possessed, and they were absolutely amazing. And I'll never forget them, and will always be grateful to them. And they continue to give us that support.
Where did you find the strength to speak at the funeral? Because you were speaking to the whole world.
Well, the number of people who've asked me that, it's actually unbelievable, but I wasn't speaking in front of the whole world. I was speaking in front of one person, for one person. And I know I wavered a bit, but the rest of the world, I was there for him. And that's where I got the strength from.
How important was it for you to speak that day?
In my opinion, from a selfish point of view possibly, but I had to do it. I had to let him know.
It was a great tribute to George that so many very, very famous people made the effort to come to Belfast that day.
Yes, it was a great tribute. However, if I could just say that the day of George's funeral, from our perspective, wasn't for the famous people. And it's not to say that we were very delighted that they came, but George's funeral was for the ordinary people. It wasn't for the great and the good. They came and they enjoyed, but it was for the ordinary people. George was going to have a day later on where all the great and the good, which we did have in Manchester, but it was for the ordinary people, and they came in their tens of thousands.
As is so often the truth of these things, from a dark cloud emerges a silver lining, and that silver lining is George Best Foundation, which you and Norman have worked tirelessly to get going and move forward. What does that mean to you and the family?
The George Best Foundation had to be, it was a chance remark by Professor Williams the day of the funeral when he saw the organisational skills which had been shown in getting it put together. Just said, Norman, and you have to do something. You've got to grasp this. And we did do it, and we were nervous at the start, and it was such a mammoth task, and continued to be a mammoth task. It took us 5 months to get it up and running, legally above board. It has tested our relationship unbelievably. But when we're having a bad day and we look at all the good reasons and we look at all the positive things which have happened, and it's keeping George's memory, it's keeping his legacy going, and if we can do good, then we'll continue for as long as we can. It's vitally important work.
What do you hope the foundation will achieve, Barbara?
Well, our main objective is obviously to raise money for research into liver disease, very important in aspect of George and the football, which was George's passion. And I'm delighted to say that just recently we've been able to present to Professor Williams £100,000 for a very exciting breakthrough which they've discovered into liver research, and that's been what the hard work has been for.
Barbara, how do you want your brother to be remembered?
I suppose for what he wanted to be remembered for his football. Forget all the other rubbish. And I have this mission that if I can just change the mind of one cynic, that's good enough for me.
you were aware of the publicity surrounding him, not only as a footballer, but by this time his private life was really making headlines. So did you approach that with a sort of degree of trepidation?
Of course, everyone did know who George Best was. When you asked me if I approached it with a degree of trepidation, no, I didn't. However, whenever that we first made contact with George again, we arranged to meet in the Holiday Inn in I think it was Chelsea. And what happened was I was prepared for this guy who was going to be very, very full of himself, who was a guy who was regularly in the limelight. And as I say, I wasn't at all antagonistic, but I wasn't going to be impressed by George Best. And we met up in that Holiday Inn in Chelsea, and his charm immediately won me over. Because he had that way with people, he was a charmer.
Now, over the next 20 years, you built up quite a close relationship with him. Good times and bad. Tell me about some of the good times and tell me about some of the bad.
It's very hard to actually pin down what is a good time and what isn't. The fact is that we went out, Barbara, myself, Alex and George, and we had good fun. This could have been at a restaurant, it could have been in a hotel. We just seemed to bounce off each other, and with such a very uncomplicated relationship.
And how did you find him as social company?
At the start, I think that George had perhaps built up a degree of armour against people, because obviously throughout his life he'd been part of this circle where that people would have always been approaching him, and people were always trying to claim they were his best friends, etc., etc. And to a certain extent, he was abused by these people. It took some time for perhaps him to realise that our relationship was, as I say, uncomplicated. I didn't want anything out of it except for my friendship with him as a person, and I think he came to accept that.
Did being a true friend mean telling him he was drinking too much?
No, because George was his own man. And he once said to me that if he wanted a drink, he could get a drink anywhere. I wasn't going to preach to George. I wasn't going to pontificate to him. I didn't enjoy seeing him drinking. But we could only watch him drink and try to do our very best to make sure that he didn't come to any harm.
And could you give me an example of any time or incident when you were able to do that, when you prevented him coming to any harm?
I suppose an example of it might be whenever he was going through a bit of a bad spell down in Portavogie, and we had a phone call to say that he was in a particular establishment. And Barbara and I drove down there, and he had actually moved on from that one to another. And I walked into this establishment, and he was sitting there on his own with a bottle of wine. And I simply said to him, "George, don't you know this isn't doing you much good?" And he said, "Yes, mate, I know." And I said, "Shall we go?" And he says, "Okay." Now that's about the only time that I broached the subject with him. I would say the very, very worst thing that you could do with George Best was to say to him, "George, you're not going to drink."
As you got to know him better and better, Norman, how would you sum up his qualities as a man?
He was a man of great personal charm, of great generosity, a man with a brilliant sense of humour, extremely intelligent, He was a man who had a particular skill that if he happened to meet somebody once, they would remember that for the rest of their days. And in fact, how many people have you heard say, I was a good friend of George Best, and they perhaps only met him once because he had this sheer charisma about him that made people feel they were his friend.
Can I take you to the week after George's death and the week leading up to the funeral? That was obviously a crazy, crazy time. Apart from the fact so many arrangements had to be made for a very public occasion. Tell me about your role in all of that.
Well, I think that it was the very day that George died, and the family all were upstairs in a room in the Cromwell, and we were speaking about how things were going to go, because we realised this was going to be a fairly major event. Now, I said to them all, I will act as your representative. I will help fulfill your wishes as long as I have your full permission. And the family then said, fine, away that you go. And we flew back on the Saturday, and we started our meetings with Castlereagh Borough Council on the Sunday. From the Sunday right the way through to the day of the funeral, it was just meeting after meeting with police, with the RAF, with the funeral directors, with the protocol people, with such a variety of people to ensure this was going to be carried off with the aplomb that it deserved. One thing which will stick with me was that there was a phone call to Barbara's dad's house from Peter Haynes' office, and they said to us, whatever you want, you can have. And for a person like me from a very ordinary background, being put in a position of being able to call upon resources from across the spectrum for 6 days was really, really outstanding but strange.
What's your lasting memory of the day of the funeral itself?
There's so many things. I suppose that if there's one major thing will stick with me was Barbara and how she managed to hold it all together. It was just, I suppose, another memory is going there in the cars, and what you do is to practically feel the emotion coming from the people who were standing at the side of the road. You could practically touch it. Now that's something else which will stick with me for a very long time.
So let's move on after the funeral and look back over the last 10 months, and there are certain standout events. I'll talk to you in a minute about the foundation, but talk a bit about the renaming of the airport.
At the time, the family were getting approached by many, many groups and many, many organisations trying to honour George in various ways. But as a family, the decision was taken that the most fitting way to honour George would be the renaming of the airport. And we had a look around the world, and you see the John F. Kennedy Airport, etc., 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 all tributes to great people. And I thought, what a fitting tribute for George to have the airport of his home city called after him.
And what about the day itself, when it all came together?
The actual day that the airport was renamed, we were not involved per se with much of the organisation of it. But it all ran like clockwork, with the exception of the actual unveiling itself, which there was a slight technical hiccup. But again, I felt a great pride in Barbara standing up there and speaking in front of all these people and speaking so very, very eloquently. And that was the same day that we had a birthday party for George down in the Belfast City Hall. So all in all, that day was very hectic, obviously, but very special. Our entire existence has been altered out of all shape. We were originally planning to retire to France next year. And then, of course, we had the start of the foundation, which has now taken over our entire existence. We both work at it very, very hard for the very best of reasons. If we can hopefully perpetuate George's memory in a positive way, that in another 15 or 25 or 50 years' time, there will be kids playing football in the George Best School of Excellence here in Northern Ireland, and then maybe even out abroad, because we've got plans to maybe have a School of Excellence in South Africa too. And then align that with the possibility that through George, there may be a major breakthrough in research into alcoholism and its effect upon the liver. What more fitting tribute?